people may look at the same facts and come to a different conclusion. Obviously they have, but that represents my view as president. In some areas involving the national interest, the news would be worse before it gets better. And I think that the American people might just as well realize that.
Thank you. Talked about and read stories of 7,000 to 15,000 guerrillas operating in Vietnam, killing 2,000 civil officers a year, 2,000 police officers a year, 4,000. Now, there's been an election in Vietnam in which 75% of the people, or 80%, endorsed the government. And yet we read how Vietnam is in danger because of guerrilla operations carried on by this small, well-disciplined, well-supplied, across the border group of guerrillas. How we fight that kind of a problem, which is going to be with us all through this decade, seems to me to be one of the great problems now before the United States.
The issue of what Kennedy might have done in Vietnam is both fascinating and potentially important. I like to call it virtual history. Professional historians traditionally called it counterfactual history. I suppose because there's factual history, that is, the story of what happened, and then there's an infinite number of stories about what didn't happen. That would be your counterfactual history. The most famous example of this, the one that's usually held up by people who don't like the idea of, in effect, writing the history that didn't happen, is to suppose that history would have been far, far different if Cleopatra had had a longer nose and Mark Antony hadn't taken an interest in her, and the whole story of the Roman Empire would be different, and if the story of the Roman Empire would be different, the history of the Western world would be different, and if the history of the Western world were different, the history of the whole world would be different, and so therefore everything in history hinges on the length of Cleopatra's nose. Now, you can take it to this absurd level, and it's often done by people who are worried about the chaos or the anarchy of a history that delves into things that did not happen.